What is going on, everybody? It's your boy Jimmy James 59, and with all of the discussion about the new Three Kingdoms DLC, I wanted to return to a tried and true, steady civilization hailing all the way back from the Age of Kings, and that's the Byzantines. And in particular, I want to talk to you about a unit that I think is still regarded well, but definitely at a time was the most powerful unit in the game, at least sort of in the mainline units of the game, and that'd be the Paladin. The Byzantines are a civilization that have access to the Paladin, and yet we barely see the Civ use them. In this video, I want to talk about why that is, and what we should do about it. So my plan of attack here is to basically give you an idea of why I'm talking about this, describe the Byzantines very quickly for those of you who've never heard of the Civ or maybe new to the game, and then give you some arguments, whether or not Byzantines should actually have access to the unit, and then give you my final verdict. So why am I doing this? Well, there's a few reasons. First is that Civ balance is always changing, as we've seen in the new patch, and hey, you gotta be willing to not hold a civilization, say, too sacred, right? Every civilization needs to kind of change with the times. Additionally, with so many new Civs, especially pretty strong ones, you might be seeing a little bit of power creep seep into the game. I think this is a much more complicated topic, but it's just something we should have on our mind and think about, again, how we're going to update civilizations, especially our legacy Civs that, we all know and love to, keep relevant in the new game. The Paladin is also a very exclusive unit, one of the rarest units to have in the game. And so, if a civilization is going to have it, right, that is a pretty big deal. So Byzantine Paladins, by extension, are a big deal. Additionally, the Byzantines have received a number of changes in Age of Empires 2DE, a lot of them naval, but actually not limited to that. They're Castle Age unique technology, right? Affects bombard towers now. So, again, Byzantines have got some changes. Free town patrols, pretty recent too. But other civilizations have had many, many more changes. Again, the Hindustanis used to be the Indians. They were split up. Incas and Malay have received big changes. And you can go back to the Age of Conquerors, Age of Kings. Many civilizations on this list have had big changes. I would say the Persians and the Saracens are two on this list that probably stick out the most to me, though I think Chinese and Koreans nowadays actually just got major changes. But the Persians and the Saracens are civs that I kind of view in the same conversation, at least with the Byzantines, maybe sort of regionally in terms of their unit comps, that kind of thing. And at the end of the day, right, all the civs are changing. We just got to be willing to sort of flex with it. That being said, we do want to keep in mind who the Byzantines are and structure them accordingly. So I put some information here. Again, you can see some bonuses, text, etc. for the Byzantines. And what we're talking about here is a civilization that, well, it has a generic economy, really makes use of cost savings, right? So you can see counter units being cheaper, free town patrol, town watch, a cheaper imperial age, that kind of thing. That's how you leverage this Civ. Additionally, this is a Civ that has the most open technology tree in the game. However, I think the Byzantines are defined as much by the technologies they lack as the ones they do have. And in particular, missing bloodlines, blast furnace, and siege engineers really keep you a civilization that doesn't necessarily have the durability in the mid game, but also doesn't have the attack in the late game to, feel like a big heavyweight Civ. And what this means is that you get army compositions that are often cheaper, that are often imperfect, or at least kind of medium power, but you get a big variety of them. And so with the Byzantines, this winds up being kind of like a cruiserweight Civ that can throw a lot of different things at you, rather than a Civ, say, like, I don't know, maybe Teutons or Slavs that's built around having a lot of, like raw power, beefy units and, brute force kind of stuff, right? The Byzantines, right? Much more finesse, much more of an athletic Civ, in the game. And for that reason, what do we see with the Byzantines? Well, we tend to see you play strong defense, right? Early on. It tends to be kind of a counterpunching Civ. Building big armies is actually something you tend to see a lot with this civilization because units are so much cheaper and it's just a much better trade in terms of resources. So again, lots of ways you can play the Byzantines. I actually think that they're kind of misclassified as a defensive civilization, even though, yes, their defenses are good, don't misunderstand me, but I just feel like they do a lot more than that. But anyways, that's the Byzantines. So, should they keep access to the Paladin? Well, there's basically two arguments here. The first is that the Civ has had the unit since the beginning, and the second is that the Byzantines are a really well-balanced civilization. And both of those are true, but let me give you the counter arguments to them. The first is that, as I mentioned earlier, lots of civilizations have received changes, so I can throw that one out immediately. The second one is that we don't really see the Byzantines make Paladin almost ever. So if the Byzantines are perfectly balanced and they almost never used a Paladin, then clearly having the Paladin or not is not affecting that balance. Like, I think if I were to go into the game and just delete this unit from the Byzantines, nobody would notice for a very long time. So if you removed it, I don't think it would affect the civilization's balance. Now, the real question we should be asking, though, is whether it even makes sense for the Byzantines to have Paladin in the first place, which takes us to the argument about losing access. And there's a few arguments here, and I'll dive into each one of them individually. But the first is this idea that Paladins are Paladins. The second is that Paladin doesn't really fit the Byzantine identity from a military perspective. You already have a heavy cavalry unit that satisfies the role of heavy cavalry. There's pretty good justification out there to give Paladins to another civilization, and ultimately, this is going to let us better align the civilization around its true or intended military identity. So, when it comes to Paladins or Paladins, look, Byzantine Paladins are objectively good units. This is a heavy cavalry unit that is worthwhile, even if it misses things like Bloodlines or Blast Furnace. And it actually would go well, really well, in fact, with your cheap skirmishers. And so for that reason, I don't think the Paladin fits the Byzantine military identity. As I mentioned, right, Byzantines are obviously intended to kind of lack that pound-for-pound strength. We have units like camels, arbalesters, etc. These are cost-efficient units. These are medium power units that you tend to build your militaries around. Not only that, but the cataphract is already going to satisfy that heavy cavalry role, right? And the cataphract is a unit, not a lot of pierce armor, right? Not a lot of base damage. You can already see the sort of finesse nature, relying on counter damage, relying on absorbing bonus damage from opponents, right? And I think with the Byzantine Paladin, if you really started seeing this more or made it a little bit more viable to go for, I just think it competes with the cataphract skirmisher composition. And for that reason, right, I think it's generally not a good idea for two units to compete with each other so closely. Because of all that, I think there's great reason here to just give Paladins to another civ, right? Again, there's other civs in the game I think that are probably suffering from power creep far more than the Byzantines. They might benefit from this unit. If the Paladins are not going to be used by the Byzantines, you know, some other civilization could probably use it, and actually we see it on the battlefield a lot more. And the last thing here is that losing access to Paladin really gives us a chance to, if we want to keep Byzantines and their most open tech tree reputation alive, we can actually try to theme the civilization better. Because again, we don't want them to lose that top spot, but we got to be careful about it because the Byzantines are, I think, a well-balanced civ, so we don't want to do something new that distorts that. So, as you probably can tell, my final verdict here is that Byzantine Paladins I do think are underutilized, but even despite that, they don't fit the civ's identity. And so I do think the Byzantines should lose access to the Paladin, and again, you know, you could come at me on this if you'd like, but again, I really don't think that this would affect the civilization balance. Just missing this unit, you know, I don't think we'd see a change in the win rate. That's just me, right? Maybe a bunch of people are using this unit out there in the world, but I don't know. I've seen a lot of Age of Empires, and it's pretty rare. So, with that being the case, though, right? Byzantines are well balanced. Want to keep them number one spot. Let's see if we can give them some compensation. And my proposal is this. I think the Byzantines should get access to Parthian tactics. That would give you a heavy cavalry archer that was only missing bloodlines. So, what would be the argument for this? Well, I'm glad you asked. Thank you. So here we go. There's a number of reasons here. The first one is that it's a great fit historically. I read a thesis, and I want to actually quote. I'll put a link to it or somewhere, or maybe a reference in the description of this video. But I wanted to quote this from Westermeyer's thesis, and it's worth saying, reading aloud in full, that the Romano-Byzantine adoption of this weapon is the only case, at least in the West, where a society without a tradition of mounted archery has successfully created an army of native mounted archers. To a large degree, the success of the empire from the 5th century on depended upon the success of its mounted archers. I can't think of a better historical, quote to advocate giving the Byzantines cav archers that are a little bit better than they are now. Additionally, I think it really fits the style of gameplay. Lacking bloodlines means you're going to be a civ that kind of wants to dance around a little bit more fire support, a little bit of moving around. Basically, you'd have a cav archer versus other archers in the Imperial Age, not in the mid-game. You're going to be weak in the mid-game, missing bloodlines. But if you can survive to the late game, which is what the Byzantines typically like to do, you'd have a heavy cavalry archer that, versus ranged units, is about as good as, say, like Spanish, Lithuanian, Hindustani cav archers. And then in situations versus melee units, it'd basically be about the same as it is now. So again, I think it'd be a pretty situational unit there. Additionally, Parthian tactics really fits the Byzantine civ identity. Armor is going to give you that resiliency. Spearmen are going to give you a nice bonus damage versus counter units. Again, decent resiliency, doing counter damage. That's the Byzantines. Not only that, but I think that this would not disrupt the civ's balance that much. Parthian tactics is available in the late game, and it only affects the cavalry archer, so we're not, changing the mid-game, feudal age, not really changing the evolution of the civilization. And I think this would give you a pretty interesting power composition. It would have a number of flaws, again, which I think is true of a lot of Byzantine compositions, but, hey, getting heavy cavalry archer and hussar, that's still pretty good. But because it would be so situational, right, it has so many flaws, I think we'd still see all of the unit compositions we still see in the game. The only difference would be that, well, unlike the Paladin, which we never see, I do think we would see situations where the Byzantines would make heavy cavalry archer. Lastly, I think this would give the civ some uniqueness. With the Khitans now, we see a civilization that looks like it's going to have heavy cavalry archer with all the upgrades except bloodlines, so this might not be as unique as it was, or would have been maybe like, a week ago. But still, in a game where we have 50 civilizations, it's becoming difficult actually to find units that are, not duplicated. I think that with something like the Byzantines and the Byzantine Hussar combination with cavalry archers, I just think it'd have a unique comp. I still think this would be a pretty unique CA, especially given it doesn't have any direct bonuses. And I don't know, that would be nice to see. It'd be nice to see how that unit performed. So, this is my final verdict. I think the Byzantines should lose access to Paladin and gain access to Parthian tactics. And so what we would go from is we would have 2 units in the Byzantine tech tree, Paladin and heavy cavalry archer, that are just kind of lurking around. And Byzantines, which I think would have a reason to play them more, right? We would see that unit more, and we'd also be able to give Paladin to a civ that will use it. So instead of 2 units that will never be used, I think we will see both of those units being used. It's just that one of them, the Paladin, would be with a different civ. So this seems to me like a very winning idea. I also don't think that these changes would really be that much of a buff or a nerf. I think really what we're doing here is we're just doing a bit of a reallocation around the civilization's techs to just make it in line with the historical and in-game identity of the civ. History and gameplay coming together. What more could be better? So these are my conclusions, right? You can disagree, you can agree. I hope you enjoyed this video. But hey guys, with that being said, I'm Jimmy James 59, and I'll see you out there in the ladder. Peace.